Robert Redford was one of the greatest names in modern Hollywood. The 89-year-old actor died early this morning at his home in Utah. That's according to his publicist.
Some Hollywood legends leave behind more than films. They leave behind secrets, rivalries, and stories that don't fade even when the curtain falls. Robert Redford's passing shocked the world, but the whispers that followed were louder than the tributes. Behind the polished smile and golden image was a man who carried grudges that never healed, fractured friendships, and rivalries that shaped his entire career. One name in particular stands out, a star so powerful, so unforgettable, yet so unlikely to pay his last respects to Redford. What could have kept two legends of Hollywood so far apart, even at the very end? Robert Redford's final days. When the sad news of Robert Redford's passing broke on September 16, 2025, it sent a wave of reflection across Hollywood and beyond. Audiences around the world paused to remember a man who had been a defining presence in American cinema for more than 6 decades. Redford was one of the rare actors whose career was as much about substance as it was about fame. He had been a box office draw, an Oscar-winning director, and the founder of the Sundance Institute, which changed the path of independent filmmaking forever. Yet as tributes poured in, many could not help but think about the quieter side of his final years and how he had gradually stepped away from the spotlight long before his death. The turning point came in 2018, when Redford finally spoke openly about retirement. For years, he had hinted that he might step away, but in an interview while promoting The Old Man and the Gun, he confirmed that the film would mark the end of his acting career. The movie, in which he played an aging bank robber who could not stop pursuing his passion even late in life, became an unexpectedly fitting metaphor for his own journey. Redford told the Associated Press at the time, "I figure now as I'm getting into my 80s, it's maybe time to move toward retirement and spend more time with my wife and family." Despite the announcement, Redford was not able to completely walk away without one more moment on screen. In 2019, he returned for a cameo in Avengers Endgame, playing Alexander Pierce, a character he had introduced in Captain America: The Winter Soldier. The appearance was brief, but it held significance. Redford had built his career on challenging dramas and character-driven stories, and his decision to appear in the Marvel franchise surprised many. Yet he explained that his interest was in experiencing the new technologies and methods being used in blockbuster filmmaking. In fact, the Russo brothers, who directed Endgame, later revealed that Redford told them the day of filming would be his last day of acting ever, and that short scene became the symbolic closing of a remarkable film career. In the years that followed, Redford shifted his focus even further away from Hollywood. In 2020, he sold his horse ranch in Utah, a property he had owned for decades. The sale allowed him to concentrate on his home in Provo Canyon and his Sundance property, both of which were central to his identity outside of acting. Utah was not simply where he lived. It was where he had built Sundance into a cultural institution that has given countless filmmakers their first opportunities. Robert's final years were marked by a slower pace, surrounded by family and nature. He had long been interested in art, painting, and environmental preservation, and those pursuits filled much of his time. He spent quiet days with his wife, Sybil Zaggers, and remained close to his children and grandchildren in an environment that revolved around art and nature, rather than Hollywood or fame. Even though he had retired from leading roles, Redford remained connected to storytelling. He continued to work behind the scenes as a producer, and he played an important part in the AMC series Dark Winds, which premiered in 2022. In 2025, he made a small on-screen appearance in the show's second season, a quiet role that carried weight precisely because of its rarity. That ended up being his final performance. When he died peacefully at his home in Sundance, it was the conclusion of a life that had been lived on his own terms. The tributes that followed showed the wide reach of his influence. Actors, directors, and producers pointed to Sundance as the reason they had been able to start their careers, and fans remembered the unforgettable characters he brought to life. Yet even with the overwhelming praise, Redford's passing also brought to light his controversial reputation, which had often led to conflict in Hollywood. Redford had worked with many of the biggest names in the industry, but he also clashed with some along the way. And these conflicts have shaped speculation about who may or may not be present at his funeral. Redford's final years may have looked peaceful on the surface, but the truth is that his life had always been shaped by deep personal struggles. Long before the world celebrated him as a movie star, he carried the weight of illness, loss, and heartbreak, experiences that influenced the choices he made both on screen and in private. A life marked by struggles. Robert Redford's struggles began in childhood, when he was diagnosed with a mild case of polio, an illness that frightened parents across America at the time. Although his condition was not as severe as many other cases, and he eventually recovered, the experience forced him to confront frailty at a young age. It also left him with a deeper sense of vulnerability than most children his age ever had to think about. This early awareness of how quickly health and stability could disappear was something that would quietly remain with him throughout his life. The pain of illness in childhood was followed by something far more devastating when he became a teenager. In 1955, when Redford was only 18 years old, his mother, Martha, died due to complications during childbirth. Losing a parent at such a formative stage left him shaken in ways that never left him, and he often described her death as the most painful event of his youth. The loss meant that at the threshold of adulthood, he had to live with a constant sense of absence, and it forced him to face responsibilities and emotions that most young men of his age were not prepared to handle. It also contributed to the introspective nature that people would later notice in him, because the experience of losing her gave him a seriousness that he carried even when the world saw him as a golden boy on the screen. After his mother's death, Redford's home life in Van Nuys, California became more complicated. He grew up in a working-class environment, and while there were people all around him, he often felt isolated from them. He later admitted that he was a solitary young man, more comfortable in his own thoughts than in large groups, and that sense of separation was a constant theme in his early life. When he married historian Lola Van Wagenen in 1958, it seemed as though life was opening into a new and happier chapter, but tragedy struck once again almost immediately. Their first son, Scott, died at only 10 weeks old from sudden infant death syndrome. The death devastated the young couple, and even though Redford rarely spoke about it in interviews, the grief never truly left. The pain of losing Scott gave him a deeper understanding of fragility in family life, and it also reinforced his determination to protect what he held dear from public intrusion. Robert and Lola went on to have 3 more children, Shauna, James, and Amy, and for many years their marriage gave him a foundation as he built his career. But the shadow of loss returned decades later in a way that was just as heavy as his earliest tragedies. His son, James, who had long suffered from a rare liver disease, underwent 2 transplants just to survive and lived most of his life with serious health challenges. Despite his illness, James carved out his own career as a filmmaker and activist, often working on projects that reflected his passions for the environment and social issues. In 2020, however, James tragically passed away at the age of 58 from bile duct cancer, a complication of his earlier health struggles. Redford was 84 years old when it happened, and he admitted publicly that he was heartbroken. To lose one child is a grief that never heals, but to lose 2 at different stages of life was a weight that even a man of Redford's strength carried heavily. But these tragedies were not the only personal battles Redford had to deal with. His marriage to Lola had lasted for nearly 3 decades, but by 1985 they divorced. Redford never fed speculation about the reasons for their separation, refusing to turn his private life into entertainment for others. For him, those details were not for public consumption, and his silence on the matter reinforced his lifelong habit of guarding his personal life. After many years on his own, he eventually found companionship again with the German artist Sibylle Zaggers, whom he married in 2009. With her, he built a later life centered on art, nature, and privacy, away from the industry that had defined his career. Unlike many celebrities of his generation, Redford had no interest in exposing his family life for attention or public sympathy. He had seen too much loss, and the best way he knew to protect himself and those closest to him was to keep that part of his life away from the cameras. Redford never fit into Hollywood's system. He liked doing things his own way and never changed himself to please the industry. However, while this made some people admire him, it also created tensions that left certain relationships strained. Redford versus Hollywood. Robert Redford may have been one of the most recognizable actors in the world, but he was never fully comfortable with the machinery of Hollywood. From the very start of his career, he was uneasy about the way the studio system operated, and he never hesitated to let people know how he felt about it. He often spoke about his dislike for studio politics and the endless bureaucracy that seemed to come with every project. Where many actors learn to navigate the system by staying quiet or by compromising with executives, Redford often chose the harder road, insisting on creative freedom even when it caused tension. One of the earliest and most visible examples of this came with The Great Gatsby in 1974. Redford was cast as Jay Gatsby, and while the film had all the makings of a major hit, a beloved novel, an A-list cast, and a big studio behind it, Redford was unhappy with both the script and the casting decisions made around him. He disagreed with the direction the film was taking, and he made his frustration known. In the end, he refused to attend the premiere, a rare move for a star of his size at the time, and a clear signal of how far he was willing to go to stand by his beliefs. This attitude defined much of his relationship with Hollywood. He clashed frequently with executives over creative control, pulling out of films when he felt the projects weren't being handled in a way he could support. For example, he reportedly walked away from a movie called Blue at the last minute, leaving the studio scrambling. Even when he was already signed on as the lead, like in Indecent Proposal, he nearly quit the film altogether, citing disagreements over how the story was being developed. To studio heads, Redford's reputation became complicated. He was bankable and beloved by audiences, but unpredictable when it came to actually finishing projects. Colleagues and Hollywood execs often complained that he had another habit that frustrated them. He was known for being late or even skipping meetings entirely. For many actors, this might have damaged their careers, but Redford's talent, box office draw, and growing influence as a filmmaker and activist made him difficult to ignore. He could afford to take risks with his career because he had built enough power and credibility that people still wanted him involved in their projects, even if he wasn't the easiest star to work with. But Redford didn't see this behavior as rebellion for its own sake. He genuinely disliked Hollywood's emphasis on money and control over artistry, and he believed filmmakers needed an alternative space to create work on their own terms. That belief led to one of his most important contributions to the industry, the founding of the Sundance Institute and the Sundance Film Festival. Redford wanted Sundance to be a haven for independent filmmakers who struggled to break through in an industry dominated by big studios. He gave young directors and writers the resources to tell their stories without having to water them down for commercial gain. The impact of Sundance cannot be overstated. Directors like Quentin Tarantino, Chloe Zhao, Ryan Coogler, and countless others first gained attention there, using the festival as a launchpad for careers that would eventually reshape Hollywood. For Redford, Sundance was more than a film event. It was a direct counterweight to Hollywood's commercialism. It represented the type of cinema he believed in, one that gave space to new voices and risk-taking ideas instead of safe, predictable blockbusters. Redford's independence wasn't limited to filmmaking. He was also outspoken on social and political issues at a time when many stars stayed quiet for fear of alienating audiences. He used his fame to advocate for environmentalism, Native American rights, and queer community causes, often weaving these themes into the projects he chose to support. Films like The Candidate and All the President's Men were not only entertaining political dramas, but also reflections of his own belief in questioning authority and holding powerful institutions accountable. For Redford, art and activism were not separate. They were connected, and he used Hollywood's reach to highlight causes he cared about deeply. Of course, his outspoken nature and refusal to play along with Hollywood norms didn't always win him friends. There were rumors throughout his career that he refused to work again with certain actors or directors after personal or professional conflicts. Though true to his character, he never aired these disputes in public. He believed silence was more powerful than feuds, and so while he had strong opinions about people he clashed with, he avoided turning those disagreements into headlines. This made him both respected and mysterious, because colleagues never quite knew what he was thinking, but they knew where they stood with him if they had worked together and failed to earn his trust. This independence, this constant push against Hollywood tradition, was both the reason for his greatest achievements and the cause of his most strained relationships. For every person who admired him for staying true to himself, there were others who found him difficult, uncompromising, or even arrogant. Yet Redford wasn't playing a part. He lived his career the same way he lived his private life, by setting firm boundaries and sticking to his principles no matter the cost. And while Redford rarely named names when it came to his conflicts, there were some professional relationships that broke down so publicly that it became impossible to ignore. One in particular involved one of the most important screenwriters of the 20th century, a man whose words had helped define Redford's career in its early stages. But their fallout showed that even partnerships built on brilliance could not escape the pressures of ego, control, and Hollywood politics. The fallout with William Goldman. When people talk about Robert Redford's career, it's impossible to ignore the role that screenwriter William Goldman played in shaping it. Goldman was one of the most celebrated writers in Hollywood, a man whose scripts defined entire eras of cinema. He was the mind behind Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, the movie that not only gave Redford his breakout role but also attached his name forever to the Sundance identity. Goldman would later go on to write several other hits, picking up 2 Academy Awards for screenwriting along the way, and earning a reputation as one of the sharpest and most influential writers the industry had ever seen. Redford and Goldman's early collaboration seemed like the perfect pairing. Goldman provided witty dialogue and strong story structure, while Redford brought star power, charisma, and a sharp sense of how characters should be presented on screen. Together, they created moments of film history. But underneath the success, there were creative differences that would eventually grow into one of the most painful fractures of Redford's career. The breaking point came during the making of All the President's Men in 1976, the film adaptation of Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein's investigation into the Watergate scandal. Redford was deeply invested in this project. He had personally acquired the rights to the book, he was producing the film, and he was also starring in it as Woodward. To him, this was more than another movie. It was a statement about journalism, truth, and power. Because of that, he wanted every detail to be right, from the performances to the script. William Goldman was hired to write the screenplay, and on paper, it looked like a perfect match. Goldman was fresh off his Oscar win for Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, and he was known for turning difficult material into compelling drama. But as production went on, Redford and director Alan Pakula grew increasingly frustrated with Goldman's drafts. They believed the script was too stylized and didn't capture the raw detail of investigative reporting that the story demanded. Redford later claimed that he and Pakula ended up rewriting large sections of the film themselves, leaving only about 10% of Goldman's original script intact. That statement, made publicly by Redford, hit Goldman hard. For a writer who prided himself on his craft and who had already delivered so much for Redford's career, hearing that his contribution had been reduced to almost nothing felt like a betrayal. Goldman insisted that while revisions were made, the backbone of the film was still his work, and he was angry that Redford would downplay his role so severely. Despite the tension, Goldman went on to win the Academy Award for Best Screenplay for All the President's Men. But the victory was complicated. Behind the scenes, the industry buzzed with questions about how much of the final film truly came from Goldman's pen. The Writers Guild of America conducted an investigation into the matter, reviewing drafts and revisions, and ultimately ruled that Goldman should be credited as the sole author of the screenplay. It was a formal acknowledgement that, despite what Redford and Pakula had claimed, Goldman's contribution remained central to the film. For Goldman, the episode left scars that never fully healed. He felt that Redford had tried to diminish his role in one of the most important projects of his career, and that their creative partnership, once so promising, had collapsed under the weight of ego and control. The two men never publicly reconciled, and although they moved on to other projects, their collaboration effectively ended there. Redford, who valued loyalty and long-term relationships, seemed to accept the distance, while Goldman, who had poured his heart into the script, carried the resentment for years. To this day, many fans look back on the episode and wonder what might have happened if Redford and Goldman had managed to preserve their working relationship. Could they have created more films together that reached the same level as Butch Cassidy and All the President's Men? Or was the break inevitable, given Redford's determination to shape his projects exactly to his vision? Well, Redford never spoke in depth about Goldman after their split, and Goldman himself carried his disappointment quietly but firmly, leaving the wound unhealed. Hollywood is full of partnerships that fall apart, but this one stood out because it involved two figures who had once defined each other's work. Their fallout marked the end of one of Redford's most important creative collaborations, and it revealed once again how complicated his relationship with Hollywood really was. However, it would not be the last time Redford found himself at odds with another giant of the industry. After William Goldman, another actor with equal power, equal influence, and an equally unbending sense of pride, would find himself on the other side of Redford's stubborn streak. Robert Redford versus Jack Nicholson. When two of the biggest names in Hollywood rise at the same time, comparisons and rivalries are almost inevitable. Robert Redford and Jack Nicholson were both born in the 1930s. Both became major stars in the late 1960s and early 70s, and both came to represent very different sides of American cinema. Redford was the polished golden boy, blonde, handsome, and often cast as the all-American hero. Nicholson, by contrast, brought a darker, more rebellious energy, projecting grit and unpredictability in nearly every role. They were rarely considered friends, and though they never openly fought in public, Hollywood insiders often whispered about the quiet rivalry between them. The differences between the two men came to the surface in a few key moments, most notably around The Great Gatsby. In the early 1970s, when Paramount Pictures was developing The Great Gatsby, a number of big names were floated for the lead role. Jack Nicholson's name was among them. The part of Jay Gatsby was one of the most coveted roles of the decade and a chance to embody one of literature's most iconic characters. Ultimately, the role went to Robert Redford, who was riding high on the success of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. But Nicholson was not convinced by the casting. He reportedly felt that Redford's image was too clean, too privileged, and too polished to embody the haunted, ambitious striver that F. Scott Fitzgerald had created in the novel. Gatsby, in his view, was a man who carried scars of struggle and desperation, someone who built a fortune not out of privilege but out of a restless desire to climb. Nicholson believed he could bring that rawness to the character in a way Redford could not. Nicholson's reservations about Redford in the role were no secret. He would later remark that Redford looked like a privileged person, adding that Gatsby, as a character, would not worry about chopping his way up. To Nicholson, Redford lacked the edge, the hunger, and the rough history that defined Gatsby's core. It was not an insult to Redford's talent, but a blunt statement about how differently the two men saw the same character. These comments by Nicholson left an impression. Redford had always been careful about how he was perceived in the press, choosing his words cautiously and avoiding unnecessary conflict. However, Nicholson was more direct and often unfiltered. By questioning Redford's suitability for Gatsby, Nicholson not only created a public record of their differences, but also added fuel to the perception that the two actors viewed each other with skepticism. Nicholson's belief that he could have brought more depth to Gatsby was never tested because he never played the part, but the idea lingered in Hollywood conversations. The 1974 version of The Great Gatsby, with Redford in the lead, did not become the success the studio had hoped for. The movie earned mixed reviews, with critics often pointing to the film's glossy surface and lack of emotional bite. Nicholson's comments seemed prophetic, as though he had predicted exactly why the film would stumble. But the Gatsby moment was not the only time Redford and Nicholson found themselves circling the same roles. Both were at one point considered for the part of Michael Corleone in The Godfather. In the end, the role went to Al Pacino, whose brooding intensity reshaped what audiences expected from a mafia story. Another instance came with The Sting in 1973, one of the most beloved films of Redford's career. Nicholson had been offered the role of Johnny Hooker, the young con man who partners with Paul Newman's character in the story. Nicholson, however, turned it down, choosing instead to focus on projects like Chinatown, which he believed offered more complexity. The decision worked out for both men because Redford scored one of the biggest hits of his career, and Nicholson delivered one of the most celebrated performances of the decade in Chinatown. But the overlap reinforced the sense that they were often operating in the same space, choosing from the same pool of high-profile scripts, and measuring themselves against one another whether they admitted it or not. Despite all this, Redford and Nicholson never made a film together. For two stars of their stature, this absence speaks volumes. Hollywood often pairs rival actors, either to maximize box office draw or to create on-screen tension, but in this case, it never happened. Theories vary as to why. Some say Nicholson didn't see value in working alongside Redford, while others suggest Redford preferred to keep his projects tightly controlled and may not have wanted to share the spotlight with someone as commanding as Nicholson. Unlike Redford's fallout with William Goldman, his relationship with Nicholson never erupted into open hostility, but the tension was there, woven into the comments Nicholson made, the roles they both circled, and the silence that kept them apart professionally. For audiences, this rivalry remained mostly behind the curtain, visible only in the occasional quote or the what-if scenarios about roles they both might have played. Yet it added another layer to Redford's complicated relationship with Hollywood. He was a man who inspired admiration, but also skepticism. He was talented, but sometimes too controlled, too polished, and too careful. Which other actor do you think Robert Redford had issues with? Tell us in the comment section below. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to click on the next video on your screen like this video, and subscribe to our channel for more updates.